Bonjour à toutes et tous, vous écoutez First Print, votre podcast comics préféré pour un nouveau numéro de Super Friends. C'est l'émission qui va à la rencontre des personnes qui font vivre la culture comics et la pop culture par leur travail. Et vous le savez, on adore aller à la rencontre des auteurs et des artistes dans cette émission. Et c'est donc une nouvelle émission que l'on vous proposera en VO. Donc après le générique, ce sera que de l'anglais. On a vraiment l'honneur, l'immense plaisir d'accueillir à distance Si Spurrier et Matias Bergara pour accompagner la sortie de Saison de Sang, Step by Bloody Step en VO, qui est sorti aux éditions du Pris. On avait déjà reçu Olivier Jalabert pour parler de ce projet un petit peu hors norme, puisqu'il s'agit d'une coproduction entre la France et les États-Unis. Donc là, on est avec l'équipe créative pour rentrer dans les détails de la création de cet univers et d'une bande dessinée faite intégralement muette. Donc voilà, le générique arrive et puis ensuite on se lance en anglais. So we are really delighted to have you get here. Hello, Simon. Hello, Matias.
Hello.
So this is the first time that you've been on the podcast First Print. So the usual first question I'm just going to ask is just if you could introduce yourself a little bit to the people that might not know who you are and what work you've been doing in the last few years. So let's start by you, Simon. Who are you?
I'm a writer of comic books. I do lots of sort of big franchise stuff like X-Men and Star Wars, Sandman, Hellblazer, but also a lot of creator-owned titles, the things I'm really proud of. So Coda is another collaboration with Matias. Things like The Spire, Angelic, Cry Havoc. My background is in novel writing and increasingly in screenwriting, so quite sort of solitary things. So it's kind of become a great joy to be working in a collaborative medium like comics, especially working very frequently with a really trusted partner like Matias. So I'm going to let him talk because this book has got a lot more of his blood in it than it's got mine.
So Matias, I'm switching to you.
Well, I'm Matias. I come from Uruguay in South America. I'm an artist. I do. I don't like to call myself a comic book artist exclusively because I do illustration. I have during my life done all sorts of drawing jobs in video game industry, film, book design, and what I enjoy the most is doing comic books because it allows me to tell stories, and it's something that it's something I can do without the help of many other people's like animation or video games or whatever. So it's something I enjoy a lot. Like Simon said, we have been creating comic books together for some years now, maybe 4 or 5 years. At this point, maybe the most significant of them being Coda, published in France and other countries as well. And there's not much for me to say about myself, except that of course, I spend most of my days drawing, illustrating, or planning whatever I'm going to be doing next, like most of us artists do.
Okay, but if I look at your resume, Matias, you've not done a lot of work in the superhero field. It's not something that is of interest to you?
No. I used to love comic books and, classic superheroes and stuff. And some of those are still super influential on me. Also, good manga and comics from Europe and in Latin America as well. But it's not my favorite genre. I feel constrained in the rules of the genre visually. So I could do superheroes and mainstream stuff, but only if I'm allowed to draw my way, which is something we have done with Simon when doing Hellblazer, for instance, and a couple other projects. I can do it, but I can do it my way only. So I don't know if I would work doing the kind of graphics that the usual comic book superhero fan wants to see in a magazine.
You shouldn't. That would be sullying yourself. It would be.
It would be ridiculous. It would be ridiculous, and it wouldn't work for anyone, especially not me.
Being untrue to your own genius, which is not worth the money, if you ask me. Why draw like everybody else if you can draw like yourself?
No, it will be a shame, really. So I'm not doing that in the short term.
Okay, and the same question goes a little bit to you, Simon, because you've been doing work for like work for hire, but I guess you prefer doing creator owned. You've got more liberty when you're doing creator owned comics.
Yeah, that's about the size of it. Oddly enough, I find it harder doing sort of franchise characters. I know there are writers who see it as a sort of holiday, a vacation, to spend some time writing Marvel or DC or whatever it may be. But for me, it's much harder because I have to go looking for the things that I'm interested in rather than them just creating them from the get-go, from the beginning. So I can do it, and I can even enjoy it sometimes. And I've been very lucky in that some of the things I've written for Marvel in particular have been quite important to me as a sort of writer who wants to say something. I still have people coming up to me at conventions talking. There's one thing in particular I wrote many years ago called X-Men Legacy, which was it was all about mental health, and I still have people who come up to me at conventions and talk about how that changed their lives in a very positive way. So that's really important to me, and that's the sort of thing that means a lot more to me than did I get to write Iron Man? Did I get to do a forgettable run on Batman or whatever it may be? I wouldn't say no to those things if I had the time and the idea and the enthusiasm, but if I'm given the choice and everything else is equal, I would far rather sit down and create something new.
All right. So could you tell us a little bit about how you two met? Because you've never met in real life. So you're only doing like Zooms like we are doing today. But how did you meet, even virtually?
I guess my editor at Boom, Eric Harburn, must have seen your work. How did he come by you, Matias? Because he just came to me with your pages.
I had been doing a couple of illustrations for the Labyrinth, the adaptations, the comic book adaptations that they had been doing at Boom of Labyrinth, the Jim Henson movie. And I had been drawing fantasy stuff for quite some time, especially for my social network pages and stuff. So Eric thought that I would be a good option for doing a fantasy book, populated with fantasy trope and visual references. So he thought about me, and he hooked us up just like that. Like, hey, guys, you should meet because this might work. I did maybe a couple of conceptual illustrations based on your treatment of the story, which was quite rich and extensive in ideas and descriptions. And
sold the deal.
That was the start of it. So we immediately got along, and we have never met. But I tend to work really, really well in that dynamic. I don't know, maybe because I live in a remote country and I don't have many chances to see people directly in the industry, whether United States or Europe. So I got used to work only via email and short communications with people. So it's not as strange to me to have long working relationships with people I have never known personally. Although it's a disgrace. I mean, I will I would love to have it the other way. It's incredible.
Yeah, we need to hang out at some point, and we will. I don't doubt that we will. But it speaks mostly to Eric Harburn's brilliance as an editor. He had this weird little pitch all about a world in which high fantasy, Tolkien-esque high fantasy, is replacing our world in a kind of Mad Maxy scenario. It's a Tolkien world after the magic has gone. And he must have immediately thought of Matias and hooked us up. And it worked so utterly perfectly that cut forwards 4 or 5 years, and we're at the point now where my scripts, which are historically very long and very wordy, are now very short because I can trust Matias to do his own thing and to make it much better than I would have done if I just tried to write it as it was in my head. So yeah, it's not even just about doing your best work and then collaborating with somebody who is also doing their best work. It's about finding these relationships which are greater than the sum of their parts. And I think Matias and I have never done anything together that wasn't better than either of us could have done with anyone else in the gaps. So yeah, it's a really valuable collaboration.
So you think there might be like some kind of chemistry between two people working together that just elevates the overall work they're doing?
Guess so, yeah. I mean, when we meet, if we just immediately start kissing, then we'll know, won't we?
It works like that. It is chemistry because rather than having long conversations before we started working on Coda, it was just the treatment that Simon had written that was enough for me. I mean, I read it all. I went through the pages and it connected with me in a sense internally, and it stimulated me to work and create stuff. I don't write. I'm not a writer. I don't have that instinct to write my own stuff or create my own ideas. I interpret in a certain way. I'm an interpreter. So what moves me to want to draw a story is to have a starting point. Like someone is telling you something, someone is giving you some sort of narrative fuel. And on top of that, or with that, I construct a world or a situation or a scene or whatever, or characters, and put the whole thing to work. But it doesn't happen with me with any story or just with any text. I really need to feel motivated by it. And Simon's treatment of the story and the first few paragraphs of script for Coda were amazing, filled with ideas, filled with very intelligent dialogues and solutions and concepts. So I couldn't help but start drawing immediately, everything all at once.
Okay, but the thing is that Coda and Step by Bloody Step are in the fantasy genre. So I guess you two both got a taste for fantasy, like before doing this kind of stories. What's the interest of the fantasy genre to you as a storytellers?
Lead us off, mate. Off to you.
Well, in my case, I have to say, it's obviously something that I have always loved since I was a teenager and started discovering novels, good sci-fi, good fantasy fiction, movies, animation, manga, comic books, etc., etc. I used to gravitate toward those genres, horror, science fiction, fantasy, whatever. They were the most visually appealing to me, and I was forming myself visually at that point. So they were important. And then personally, from a professional point of view, fantasy allows me to break a lot of barriers, visual barriers that stifle me. Like, for instance, I can draw a realistic world, quoting a realistic place or stories or characters grounded in realisms in everyday life, in things that resemble the real world, but it's very tiring for me and it's not fun. But fantasy allows me to be visually inventive, to create things out of nowhere, to have fun ideas, even ridiculous ideas, and put them to paper and make them work in different ways. I can become more visually expressive, more interesting as an artist, and more visually or conceptually productive if I'm doing fantasy, because it allows me to do these kind of things. I need a world with no rules, with no rigid rules, so I can, maybe create a giant yellow whale that flies through the air, powered by machines, for instance, or whatever ridiculous idea that comes up that I found fun and potentially powerful in visual terms. So fantasy or this kind of genres allow me to do that quite freely. I wouldn't even be interested in traditional sci-fi, for instance, if I had to be super realistic or go for a kind of drawing or creation that is representative of real possibilities, like the near future, the realistic future, or a possible future. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in a ridiculous possibility and another worldly or even surrealistic kind of possibility more than anything. So I find all those possibilities in fantasy more than anything. And that's where I suppose I will be staying as an artist in the near future.
Okay.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. I mean, one of the privileges of being a writer in comics is that I can be doing several projects at once. So I have this extremely lucky privilege of being able to write a crime book and a Western and a sci-fi and a fantasy all at once. But what always draws me to the fantasy genre, I mean, there's a certain element of nostalgia. Like a lot of the stuff I grew up with that had such an impact on me spoke to that genre, whether it was Tolkien himself or things that had fun with the Tolkien tropes. Like I read a lot of Terry Pratchett as a kid. So a lot of the sort of the humor and deconstructivist, Tolkien-esque deconstruction that you find in something like Coda, it's probably quite informed by Pratchett, the sort of Discworld stuff. Mm-hmm. And then I found Dark Crystal and those sorts of fantasies which don't rely on lazy Tolkien stereotypes. And that's probably where some of Step by Bloody Step comes from. This idea that you can create a whole new world, fill it with people and creatures and societies and ideas and faiths and systems and ecologies, but they don't have to be elves and dwarfs and magic rings and all the things that you'll find in 9 out of 10 fantasy novels that you read these days, because most people just think that it starts and stops with Tolkien. What I love, and this is almost as true in sci-fi, but not quite as true, what is so perfect about creating new worlds in fantasy is that you can put a lot of thought into the world, the reality, what makes it tick, the systems that make it work, the things that make this world functional, and then ignore them, push them to the back and focus instead on characters in the foreground. Now, the best science fiction example of that is something like Blade Runner. You know, they create this incredible future world, but then ignore it because nothing that happens in the story really has any impact on the world itself. We tried to do that in Coda. The things that the characters are doing do have an impact on the world, but the point is, if the characters weren't doing what they were doing, the world would keep existing. It's a functional world. It continues to exist even after you shut the book. And when you can do that with a world, when the artist is so great at creating the visual, when the backstory exists to make it all feel functional, it no longer matters whether or not it is the focus of the story. Instead, you can do what we all do, what we have to do when we're storytellers, which is to focus on the human elements, the interactions between the characters, the way that they're feeling. We could have an absolute blast telling stories about monsters interacting with other monsters, and we would enjoy the process of creating it, but people wouldn't care very much because you can't relate to two monsters being monsters. But as soon as somebody is either human or human-ish or human-esque in some way, that's when it becomes a story. So yeah, that's sort of the rules of the game, in as much as there are rules, and you can play with those rules in fantasy in a way that makes it much freer. The metaphors are richer. The scope is much broader than in any other genre, I think.
Okay, so could you explain a little bit to us what the idea behind Step by Bloody Step? Where did it come from?
I guess, as with all projects, it's a multiplicity of things that all kind of come together all at once. I'm a very wordy writer. My scripts are very long. I write lots of dialogue. I love character voices. I drive artists like Matias mad when I'm writing character dialogue because they all talk so bloody much. You have to leave huge amounts of space in every panel for all the dialogue. But at the back of my mind was the idea that at some point I would love to try and do a story that was completely dialogue free. A real technical challenge for me and for whoever I was working with. And I never really thought about it in anything other than an abstract, something to do someday sort of way. And then having finished Coda and having enjoyed working with Matias so much, it started to tick away again. And I thought, well, maybe this is the chance. And having started from a position of what would you do if you were telling a fantasy story about characters who can't communicate with each other, it became, well, a whole bunch of other things that are interesting to me at the moment. I just had a couple of kids, so immediately it felt right that it had to be about some sort of parental, filial, child protective relationship. You turn up the dial on that and the parent ends up feeling like some sort of indestructible warrior who is solely and uniquely tasked with caring for this vulnerable little child. But of course, nobody is really invulnerable, and part of the child's development is learning that their guardian is not as perfect and invulnerable as they seem. Anyway, you can see what I'm getting at by simply sitting and thinking about all these things and putting them through a fantasy filter. What we've ended up with kind of wrote itself. It's the story of a little girl who wakes up and she has no memory, she has no voice, she has no name, she has nothing except for a giant, this gigantic armored warrior who carries her before she learns to walk and then walks beside her every step of the way. And the last element of the idea, which I'm not going to spoil because it's sort of the mystery that defines the story, is why are they walking? Why are they compelled to walk across this wild, weird, wonderful fantasy world teeming with extraordinary animals and strange technologies, all of which spill from the mind of my partner over here? Why do they have to walk? Where are they going? Why does the world come alive and force them onwards when they try to stop and go back? And who will manipulate them and take advantage of them along the way? So yeah, that's kind of the gist of Step by Bloody Step, and how it came about. But so much of what you see on the page comes about because I will say something quite vague. They encounter a monster, and then we've got 4 pages that have just spumed from Matias in the most wonderful way imaginable.
Yeah, because I was wondering, Matias, if there was any difference in your approach to this project compared to what you did just before with Coda, because it's also silent. So I guess it's also you have to work differently for that kind of project.
It's enormously different because, of course, there is no dialogue, and you have to use images to conduct the story in a very clear way. You don't have any sort of helping tips or whatever around to drive a story, so everything has to be super clear. You must avoid using elements that confuse or maybe distract the going of the action. So at a certain point in the first pages, when we were conceptualizing the story, I was picturing in my mind something really noisy, full of creatures, full of effects, full of all sorts of things to make the story interesting. You know, since there are no words, maybe it will become a sort of visual explosion of things. And quite clearly, when I started working, it turned out that wasn't the best option, because any sort of noise or excessive content in images distracts the attention from what is going on, which is really key when you are telling a story without words. When you don't have any sort of binding to words or to symbols, then everything that happens in each page and in each panel is the center of the story, the action itself. And since we have two lead characters who are the center of the story itself, what they are doing and how they are doing it becomes the center of the story. So I had to strip down many of the ideas I had, many of the visual, let's say, many of the visual personal things that I will have otherwise put in the story to make it more interesting or more visually charged. I had to wipe them all out and try to conserve only the key elements that will make this world appealing and strange and mysterious, but without distracting the reader from the key of the story. Not only what happens to these two characters is the center of the story, but their emotions, their subtle language, which is wordless, and the things that start happening to them. The story, of course, becomes much more complex as the story advances because there are other forces, other characters, and things happening simultaneously, which is kind of complicated to resolve visually without words. But that's the main difference, I suppose, that I found out only when I was already doing it. When I was on the road and already advancing the pages, I found out that the best thing for the story was to stay close to the intimate elements and not going too large all the time with distracting elements.
Okay, but doesn't it mean that because you are during the story developing a whole universe, didn't you create like some sort of Bible before doing that, or were you just developing the universe as far as the scripts were going?
No. I am a very improvisational artist. I do very few designs before starting the work. For instance, in Coda, all the main characters were designed before the story started. The maybe 6 or 7 main characters, both good and bad, were designed already. But then when the work started and I started putting pages, everything you see on each page was designed on the moment when I was doing it. The architecture, the places, the scenery, the characters, the creatures, the population, the objects, machines, whatever there is, I designed them on the spot when I was doing each page, which is my way of working. I am not a very organized designer, and I don't need to have everything designed beforehand to be able to work. In fact, I have a lot more fun doing my work if I can, just put things immediately when I am doing it. I have no design sheets for characters or things except for a few ones. So, and it wasn't any different in Step by Bloody Step. I did it, that way, exactly the same.
Okay, and I think you mentioned in other interviews I've gathered on the internet that now the scripts that Simon are giving you are quite short compared to what they were before. So I really want to know how you can do this whole world building during the whole Step by Bloody Step adventure, because we start from like a very a cold area, then we've got to more swamps, mountains and you've got also cities like almost futuristic cities. So how I think there's the question of you have to fit all these different elements into a coherent structure. I don't know how you managed to do that.
It's probably because it's a mixture of all the things that I really like. Coda was the same. Sometimes I find joy in drawing complex architecture. Sometimes I think the story will be benefited by good scenery, natural scenery, or maybe large expanses of scenery, or maybe smaller, intimate places. It goes with the story, at some point, even if Simon's scripts for Step by Bloody Step were shorter and simpler, it still is quite clear about the focus of what is happening in each page and in each chapter. So if there are places in the story that are described as amazing and giant and incredible, then that's what they must look like. Details are secondary. the most important part is that a place should look terrifying or beautiful or larger than life or mysterious or dangerous or intimate, whatever. Then I have total freedom to interpret that visually and decide what elements will be included in that formula. We, of course, have a lot of coming and going with Simon when we were doing Coda, so we already know what the other one is capable of and what the other one is meaning when it says something. So in that sense, it's become a very well working process for the both of us. We don't have to negotiate or say much. Simon will tell you we barely speak to each other during production. I mean, we might just maybe go over some small detail or whatever, but it's like 1% of the contents of the book were discussed. The remaining 99% was just Simon giving me a script and I doing it, and that's it.
It makes for the most spontaneous. I mean, it's frightening. Matias has said in other interviews that he's in the habit of not even reading ahead in his scripts. So it's one page, and that's I'm not going to complain because it keeps it utterly fresh, utterly spontaneous, utterly wonderful, and that's how you get the results you get. One thing I'll add to this. We sort of learned quite quickly, and Matias alluded to this earlier on with the change from a kind of visually noisy to a more simplistic approach. Not that simplistic is the right word, but you see what I mean. When a reader is looking at a page that has dialogue on it, the reader's eye cheats. It jumps from the text, reads the text, then looks quickly at what surrounds it, the visuals that surround it, to sort of confirm or juxtapose what it's just read. And then it jumps to the next panel, immediately to the text, and it goes on and on and on. When there is no text for the eye to be anchored by, every single panel acts like an investigation. The reader's eye is trying to work out what is the piece of narrative information that I am being given in this panel. And that's tiring. It's a challenge. It's quite exhausting. So instinctively, we realized that you have to give them pauses. You have to let them occasionally stop and have a breath, which is why Matias did these amazing double page spreads, which are just pure fantasy landscapes that sort of chart the progress of our characters. They act like a breath. The reader can go, I'll just take a moment. This isn't hard anymore. This is wonderful, before going into the next phase. And I think we've done it well enough that even though it's hard, it's never not enjoyable because it's always so rewarding. And that means we are getting our readers to invest emotionally, which means that when you have big emotional beats in the story, it kind of all comes pouring back out again, and the reader feels like all their investment has paid off, which is why we frequently read or are told by our readers that they are in tears when they read certain parts of the story. But, it's these quiet moments. There's not a single line of dialogue. And yet simply because of the things that happen and the relationships we've built up along the way, people are bursting into tears at exactly the right moments. So it's a really powerful, extremely difficult, but very, very rewarding way of telling a story.
I guess it was also challenging, just because it's a silent comic book that you have to adjust the balance and your pacing between the moment of pure actions, the moment of exploration, let's say, and also the moments of not dialogues, but like when the two characters have to communicate, and they do communicate. So how do you manage to do that? Because also it's in the United States, it's published in the single issue form. So you have also to keep in mind that you've only got from 20 to 40 pages, and you've got to keep the reader interested in your story. That's quite the challenge, isn't it?
I think it's all about pacing. And actually, another thing that I noticed Matias discovered along the way was that when you're not encumbered by dialogue balloons, the instinct that we have as makers of Western comics, i.e., it's an action scene, therefore let's make it big. You can kind of flip that on its head. There are some amazing action sequences in which the panels get smaller, but they're all completely coherent because there's nothing getting in the way. There's no dialogue, and it has the effect of speeding up the reader's eye. And that's the sort of genius stuff he can muck around with without me needing to tell him to do it in order to keep it exciting.
And was there any challenge, Matias, for you also to bring more emotion to your characters? Because if they can't speak, you have to make them express their feelings and their words without using them.
The eyes and the hands were key for that. Were very important.
The hands also.
They are the main resources you have to express, to communicate. And also they help to drive the attention of the reader in certain directions. If you want the attention of the reader to focus on something secondary that is somewhere on a panel, maybe a character looking that way will be enough to ensure that the attention is going the right way. Or maybe a hand. We have many instances of hands pointing out at things to make sure that the message is clear. And which is kind of hard because I don't like to repeat myself too much. In fact, it will be very rare if you find two exact same panels repeated unless it's deliberate on any of this. I try to make any page different and every panel different, never repeating a structure or whatever. And we came to the point where we had a problem, which was there were many instances of the giant, the warrior, pointing out at things to make sure what the next step was. Like, we must go this way, we must do this, don't do this. So I had to find out different ways to create that gesture with the hand, clearly. Maybe sometimes it was a full hand, maybe just a finger, maybe a gesture with an elbow. Or just putting her body in a place to avoid movement. So it's like Simon says, it was a challenge. For us, it was a challenge. Each panel and each page was a different sort of puzzle to be resolved. We had this problem and we had to resolve it, and not just resolve it, but also resolve it in an interesting way that was not the same twice in a row, and with small differences or big differences. So a lot of thinking went into the art before actually doing the art. And at first, it was kind of complicated for me. I wasn't going as fast as I thought I would be going, but it's just like any process. You start slow and then you gain speed. And after that, you go like in cruiser speed permanently, page after page after page. Until you take vacations.
You don't take vacations. We know that you never take vacations. You are artists. Since you were mentioning that you don't read the scripts, you just take the scripts and then draw. But there is sometimes when you've got also a long form scenario that you have to play some elements of foreshadowing, or sometimes you go back to certain elements that you've seen in the beginning, and that's something that kind of happens in Step by Bloody Step. So did you have to go back also to the first panels you were drawing to make sure that everything was coherent?
Yeah, just to check on details of certain things and make sure I wasn't, contradicting stuff that had happened before. But if something is truly, truly, truly important in the story, that's going to happen in the future, usually Simon puts it first on the first page or somewhere else. Like, this guy is not going to make it to the last page, so don't invest too much on him. Or this object, a small secondary object, is going to be super important in the future, but he doesn't tell me why. He just says, this thing is going to be key in the future. So put it somewhere where it's visible, not obvious, but visible. And that's it. That's enough for me to work. I am very proud to say I never had to go back and change things in previous pages. Never. I did not have to do that. I did make a couple of mistakes that were not crucial, but because of this of this tradition I have of reading the scripts page by page, and never knowing what's going to happen in the next. But it's minimal. It's really not something very important.
Okay, so we know that in the United States, the indie comics field is, although it's quite like a living field, because there are many editors that are launching every year and many titles, but we also know that it's kind of difficult for comics to just exist. And since you were doing something which is really original, that because not many people are doing silent comic books right now, weren't you a little bit afraid of how the market would react to this kind of project?
Yeah, I guess there was anxiety. On the other hand, I don't think we would be doing what we do if we let the market dictate the sorts of projects that we're working on. You know, again, as a writer, I'm privileged to be able to be doing an X-Men book at the same time as Step by Bloody Step. So I've got my mainstream tick in it. Perhaps I don't need to worry about that. So it's pure joy to be doing something where I don't need to worry about that. That said, 9 times out of 10, if you believe in something and put your heart and soul into it, then it becomes the mainstream. People go where the quality is, and they can sense belief, they can sense enthusiasm and honesty. So Step by Bloody Step is never going to sell as well as Spider-Man, but it will sell better than an awful lot of very tedious indie books that don't have any heart and soul in them, that are just sort of cynical. I think that's probably my answer to that. And by the way, that's exactly why we knew from the beginning, because we both love bande dessinée, because it feels like such a perfect fit, because Coda did so incredibly well all across Europe. We sort of realized from the beginning that when you're working on a book that doesn't have any particular language in it, why wouldn't you go and investigate your publishing possibilities before it comes out for the first time? So we just sort of made the rules up as we went a little bit, and it seems to have turned out really nicely.
And Olivier told me that from the beginning you knew that you wanted to do some sort of co-production between the French market and the United States.
Yeah. So the way Image usually works in particular, in fact, or any of the publishers, but for the sake of the example, Image, you would make your contract with them. It would be published in the English language, US format. And then at some point, usually after it's finished, the publisher, will go and try to sell foreign rights to all the other territories. What we've learned in the past, because I have a relationship with Olivier, because we know that there's a huge market in the French territory in particular, and especially for fantasy, we just thought, why wait? Why not sort of start from a position of saying, we have 2 publishers, one in the US and one in France. They have an existing relationship with each other, so they can work really, really nicely together. Let's just do it like that and kind of make that part of the story, make it a really interesting and exciting new way of making comics, rather than chopping it all into little pieces and trying to do it further down the line. We're still going to have to do that with the Spanish language and the German language and all the rest of it. That will happen. But it felt like a really great opportunity to just come right out of the gates with an edition in France and an edition in the US, which have been timed quite carefully, so they're not treading on each other's feet. That's where we've ended up.
Okay, so and Matias, because I've seen you drawings, so sometimes some characters from bande dessinée, like Tintin or something like that. So I guess you're also a fan of this of the European bande dessinée.
Yeah, of course. I grew up reading Tintin, Asterix, and many other. Of course, during adolescence, I found Moebius, millions of others. The classics. And also modern contemporary artists from Spain, France, Italy, lots of places. So it's have a huge influence on my on my visual instinct, so to call it. I like to call it that way. I think all artists have a sort of instinct, which is it's a personal criteria, an instinct, a sort of graphical smell about where to go and how to direct your art and what kind of personality it will have. It's a personal mix in each one. Mine has lots of European influences and also Latin American, and I suppose that makes me a sort of different artist to be in the U.S. market, in the United States publishing. That's why I don't like to define myself too strongly as a comic book artist in that sense, in the traditional sense, because first of all, I'm an illustrator, an artist. I do drawings for a living. It's what I've been doing. And I do comics because I like the possibilities of comics and what I can do with them expressively and narratively. And that is not bound by a specific industry or by a specific style. I have a very personal way of doing things. And I think when we were doing Coda and also Step by Bloody Step, we were always thinking not of a specific kind of public, but the whole world, anyone who can read. The case of Step by Bloody Step is quite specifically so because it doesn't have any words. You can open up and read it, whatever you are and whoever you are. We try to not be too specific with human references to places or to people or to whatever, to keep that clean and to keep that open to anyone reading it. And that was as well one of the reasons why the book could be released almost simultaneously, because it doesn't have any words. It doesn't have to be translated or localized into a new edition. So it can virtually be published simultaneously anywhere at the same time. You don't have to go through the translation process. And we discussed that with Olivier at first, and that's how we came up to the idea of doing a almost simultaneous release and taking out the project within these two big publishing houses.
But you still had to add some sort of a short little text between the chapters for the French version, because I don't know, because French have to have a little prose to so they can enjoy their comic books.
It was did a few different things. That it was add a little bit of extra color, let me show off some exciting language, but yeah, it's really to allow anybody who picks up, the BD album in a store in Europe to know that this is for them, rather than it just being an imported American comic. Do you know what I mean?
Mm. All right. So for the last questions, I would just like to go into spoiler territory, so we can just discuss something a little bit in the book, especially in that. So I'm just warning people that are listening to us, if you haven't read Step by Bloody Step, which is called Saison de Sang in French, so don't listen further, please. And now we are into a spoiler territory. So my first question was, I'm sensing some kind of ecological meaning in the whole adventure that we've got, because I think the French title is more explicit about what it means, about the cyclic nature of the story. So am I right or wrong?
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you're right. In my head, the little girl is some expression of time, an expression of the year, an expression of the way that the seasons change. The journey that they take around the world lasts exactly 1 year. And when they return to the place that they started, the idea is supposed to be that the little girl becomes the guardian, a new year is born, and the journey begins again. The story, as it occurs in the book, is that goes wrong. It's gone wrong because they've been manipulated. She's been seduced by human ideas. She's eaten their food. She's drunk their drink. She wants to be them. They've been waylaid by people who refuse to work with nature. Instead, they insist upon dominating it and using it for their own selfish ends. And that's why everything falls apart. But it's also why the girl is able to do what she does, which is to turn around and to retrace her steps, which is something that nobody's ever done before. You're not supposed to be able to do it. But when you are literally the living manifestation of the new year to come, maybe you can turn and walk back just to make things go the right way. And that's sort of how it came to be in my head. It's a sort of alien conception of the Persephone myth, the reason that the seasons change, the reason that the new year comes, the reason that the sun keeps rising on the longest night of the year. But I don't think any of that matters so much, that if people don't get that, if people don't understand every single dribble of that nuance, that it's still not just a really wonderful story about this amazingly powerful relationship. You don't need to understand the ins and outs of it to know that there is some sort of cyclical magic at work which defines who these people are, that defines the journey, defines their tragedy and ultimately their redemption. And that's the beauty of that moment at the end when it all begins again.
And the thing is also that the story sees like some of the characters like they are really damaged, and especially the knight. There's something really horrible that happens to him at the end of the third issue. Did you cry, Matias, when you were drawing the evolution of their relationships and see that you all had to go the whole force, the first almost the entirety of the fourth issues without one of the main characters?
No, I did not, but I wanted people to. I wanted people to feel that way, and but I used a method that I usually use myself when I'm working and I'm trying to convey some sort of emotional deepness to a character or whatever, which is not to draw from memory, like what emotions look like or what emotions are, but trying to feel it, clinging to maybe old memories or experiences from my past or certain things or people, to make sure that at least the emotions feel adequate, feel real and direct, So if you have to draw someone being sad or with a broken heart or whatever, maybe the best way is to go back into your own experiences and try to recreate a certain moment in your life to make sure that it looks right. So I was taking places from that, but I did not cry during the making of it. I quite the contrary. I usually, when I'm drawing, I'm having lots of fun. Always, it's probably the most fun I have is when I'm doing drawings and working.
Okay. Also, I've got when you take into account the difference between the model of publication between France and the United States, I think for this story, you also got the advantage that people can react to the end of each chapter, and so you've got also a more maybe a live reaction to the story you're telling, especially after the end of history, for example. Did you follow a little bit what the American readers were saying about your book?
Yeah, we have two sets of different feedbacks from each chapter, which were the critics and the readers. Usually we receive the readers via social media and the critics through websites and stuff. And everyone was quite shocked in different places of the book. We know people were really feeling different types of emotions, especially linked to fatherhood, to growing up, to accepting social rules or not, accepting power dynamics, because this is not only about the passage of time, but it's also about the passage of structures of power, accepting rules, because it's not only, the role of the guardian of the night is not just to protect the child, but also to ensure that those rules from the past are still respected and upheld in future generations and passed on. And there is a conflict there as well, which is something we can all relate to. We want to accept and accommodate ourselves to rules and to traditions and things we have received from people we like and we love. But at the same time, we have important questions during our life that might go against those rules and those ideas. So that is also a part of what makes the emotional dynamic work. So some people were reacting to that. Some people were reacting to the mystery, going back and reading again pages and finding it very interesting and mystifying. But we had all sorts of reactions from people, which were, some were expected, obviously, and some were new to us. We didn't know very much what to expect, really. We didn't know if people were going to enjoy a wordless story or if they were going to see it just as a gimmick, like we were just trying a structural trick, being artists, like we were just trying some narrative trick and nothing else, a very superficial thing. It could happen. Luckily, it did not, and people understood we were actually doing a serious story and something very, very ambitious in our part.
And what was I just want to focus on one scene, the one when the girl travels back in time. So what was the inspiration to just to visually depict that?
Well, she was breaking all the rules at that point. She was not only going back in time, but she was also breaking every rule of nature, every even the story itself. She's going pages behind. I mean, inside that world, she's going back in time, but in the book, she's kind of like walking back the pages, and she's taking charge of what is happening to her as a character, not only as a living person there in that world, but also as a character, which was quite surprising to me. I wasn't expecting that when I read the last chapter. I thought that things will simply roll forward permanently and there were going to be problems, but she actually went back and broke the rules. So I had to pick, this weird visual effects and colors and shapes to try to describe that her whole world is turning upside down and changing completely, at least during that very short period of time in which she painfully goes back. Simon was very clearful about that. He wrote that it was not a smooth process, but it was a critical and very suffering process to go back behind and go against the grain of this set of rules that were pushing her forward, and she had to push back to mend things right. Of course, we could go very deep into a psychoanalytical, maybe sort of analysis of what happens to her, because at this point, she's an adult, and she's got tools to redefine herself and choose in a different way than when she was a little kid. So in a certain way, I try to convey all that visually. It's a huge thunderstorm of dust and confusion, but she still goes into the past, which is difficult, of course. It's difficult for all of us to do this. And I think a lot of us feel this way when trying to confront things. It's not only magic that is pushing her forward, but it's also emotions and things we can all relate to.
Yeah.
Okay. You wanted to add something, Simon?
No, it's a really good answer.
Okay.
What I was really impressed by with that sequence was the sense that as she fights her way backwards, the understanding of reality itself was breaking up around her. Like Matias and Mateus, the colorer, started to use a sort of refraction effect, as if we were seeing things through a broken prism, and it really feels to me anyway as if she's not just going back in time or pushing back down a mountain. She is reordering the world because she's able to, because she has the benefit of experience, because she has had the opportunity to learn from her mistakes. And yeah, I think I've seen a few people saying, wow, I didn't expect there to be time travel, but it sort of fits and it seems to work. And I think it's because they're expressing something that comes from the gut, which is that it's not a story about time travel. It's not a story that has some sort of sci-fi twist. It is a story about somebody who is able to own her mistakes, to take charge of her future, and to use what she has learned about herself in order to do so, which is, I think, the most powerful. Yeah.
It's just a little bit different than just time traveling. Yeah.
It's the most powerful moral message you can leave any story with, I think, is to help people to control themselves.
Mm-hmm. And so, but not least, I would just wanted to ask you, what was your favorite scene from the whole book?
It's a big question.
Yes.
Okay, so for me, it's a scene that I almost didn't write. And it's also a really good example of what it's like working with Matias. I wrote a page. It's quite near the end. I think it was probably a 5-panel page when I wrote it. And it's the girl. She's walking through the mountains. She's got the gauntlet, this gigantic glove strapped to her back. She's struggling through the snow. And she gets attacked by this bunch of monsters. And the page describes how she throws some food at them and then stumbles away down the mountainside to distract them so she can get away. And Matias drew that, but he drew it in such a way that the page becomes the mountain, and we see her throwing the food and then using the gauntlet as a toboggan to sled down the mountain. I didn't write that. He wrote that. And that's the sort of wonderful stuff that will stick in my mind, because it's better than it would have been if he'd just drawn a page, or if I'd just written a page. Bang, comes together, immediate art. It's really, really great.
Okay. And you, Matias?
My favorite is I have many, but probably the one that I had the most fun doing was the first pages in which she goes in issue 4, in which she goes back in time and starts the travel back and all that, because it felt so liberating for her, and so important for what had been happening during the whole story to that point. So it felt empowering, like finally, she has been merely a vehicle for the story, a vehicle for us as writer and artist, and a vehicle for time to go forward, and a vehicle for the rules that were imposed on her, and a vehicle for traps and for power and for many stuff that happens. She's always being there, like being moved forward by an invisible force. And this is the first time in which she becomes the owner of her own destiny and changes things voluntarily. So it felt fun to try to draw what that will be like. I mean, imagine yourself in that situation, having to push back the entire world, not just a storm or a force, but the entire world, just to do things your way. And that was very fun and very passionate for me to do. So I think that will be my favorite sequence, but there are others, of course. I also love the little subtle moments in the story, the smaller panels, the little silent encounters and dynamics between the two. I also love them a lot, but it's hard to dissect the book into parts. To me, it feels like a whole sequence, a continuous sequence divided in pages. So it's very hard for me to choose.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've been speaking about Step by Bloody Step for almost an hour. So it's really great that you just allowed this interview to take place. So thank you very much for your time. It was a real pleasure to explore all this the book and how you created this whole universe. And so I'm just going to conclude in French, but I'm just thanking you both, Simon and Matias, to have been here in the podcast.
Thanks for having us. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much, too.
Et merci donc de nous avoir écoutés. On vous rappelle que si les interviews que nous faisons sur First Print vous plaisent, n'hésitez pas à le faire savoir et surtout à les partager pour faire découvrir à la fois l'émission, mais également pour mettre en avant le travail de toutes les personnes qui viennent y passer tout simplement. Donc Saison de Sang, c'est disponible chez Dupuis dans toutes les bonnes librairies. Puis voilà, on vous a bassiné là-dessus, mais c'est vraiment une BD qui est assez exceptionnelle. Donc on était vraiment ravis de vous proposer ce podcast. Merci de nous avoir écoutés et à très bientôt. Salut.